Hello, everyone, and welcome to Conversations with Matt DeLockery. Well, we have just about the least pleasant discussion in front of us that you can have, at least one of the least pleasant passages in the entire Bible. It's that wives obey your husbands, slaves obey your masters bit. And there's a lot of unpleasant stuff in the Old Testament. Some of it's worse, but everybody's a little bit like, well, that's Old Testament. Things were a little bit, rougher back there. But New Testament, with Jesus, things should be better. And then we get this. So, yeah, let me just read it. Wives, submit to your husbands, as is fitting in the Lord. Husbands, love your wives, and do not be harsh with them. Children, obey your parents in everything, for this pleases the Lord. Fathers, do not provoke your children, lest they become discouraged. Slaves, obey in all things those who are your earthly masters, not in eye service as people pleasers, but with sincerity of heart, fearing the Lord. Whatever you do, work heartily as for the Lord and not for men, knowing that from the Lord you will receive the inheritance as your reward. You are serving the Lord Christ, for the wrongdoer will be paid back for the wrong he has done, and there is no partiality. Masters, treat your slaves justly and fairly, knowing that you also have a master in heaven. There's a reason this passage gets skipped in churches all the time. We read along, we're teaching in scripture, going through, a letter, verse by verse, and then you get to this one, and it's sort of like, I don't know what to do with that. Things were different back then, and they're better now, thankfully, and we sort of muddle through it and don't really understand what's going on. So we need to talk about this, and it's going to take a while, so you need to just hold on for a minute. But I actually think this is an extremely important passage here, and there's a lot going on with Paul's thought that shows he really, really knows what he's doing here. But it's going to take me a minute to explain what's going on. So in order to be able to explain what's going on, there's ancient context that we need to understand. There's context in the letter, and then there's understanding the social changing that Paul is going about doing. So let me start with the ancient context, because I think that's going to help get us off on the right foot a little bit. In order to understand this section of the letter to the Colossians, we have to begin our story 400 years prior to this letter. We have to start it with a man you may have heard of before. His name's Aristotle. So Aristotle had some thoughts on a lot of things. He was very much a thinker. And one of the things that he thought about was how a household should be organized. And he took a look at what he considered the three principal relationships that exist within an ancient household. And that's the relation of a husband to a wife, of a father to his children, and a master to his slaves. And if you notice, the first person in each one of those three relationships is, in fact, the same person. You have the head of the household who runs and controls everything. And then the three primary relationships are about how the head relates to all of the three different members, other, members or groups of members within the household, not about how they relate to each other. So Aristotle put down what he thought was important, and he had some quite lovely, read that as heavy sarcasm, thoughts on the rational faculties of those who were not the man. They're not good. Basically, what he said to do was for the head of the household, the man, husband, father, master, to keep everybody in line and make them do as they're supposed to. And so that was lovely. And then that began a discussion on how households should be organized that lasted for hundreds of years. And at the time Paul wrote the letter to the Colossians, it was still going. So 400 years after Aristotle, people who think quite a lot, we're still talking about the best way to organize a household. So the first thing you need to understand about this section of the letter, about wives obey your husbands, slaves obey your masters, and those are really the two objectionable parts. Nobody's really worried about children obeying their parents. Paul didn't come up with this out of nowhere. He was entering into these hundreds of years old discussion on Aristotle's thoughts. So point number one to understand is Paul didn't come up with this out of nowhere. He is entering into this centuries old discussion, and he is modifying Aristotle's thoughts with his own. So it's not these three categories of relationship between husband, wife, father, children, and master, slave that's interesting here. Paul is following Aristotle. It's how he has changed Aristotle that is interesting. That's where Paul's true thoughts lie, or that's one source of Paul's true thoughts. So that's point number one we need to consider. Point number two is what Paul had the ability to change. So we live in, if you're watching this in the West, we live in a democracy. That has not been the state of most countries for most of history. Even though democracy was invented a long time ago, most countries have not lived in that. And even when democracy was invented, not everybody was, given the ability to vote. So the idea that you can give your say on what goes on in government and how people live is a really new thing. Most people for most of history had no ability to change anything. And Paul was the same. He could not have changed how society was structured, even if he wanted to. Let's take a look at slavery on this. Imagine Paul had called for the abolishment of slavery. What would have happened? Well, more than likely what would have happened, assuming he hadn't been ignored. He might have been ignored because he wasn't, very important. But either Rome would have noticed him immediately, or they would have noticed what he was writing a little bit further down the road. And as soon as they decided to pay attention to him, literally everybody would have been crucified. Because Rome was pretty big on that. And they were really sensitive about the slavery thing, because it had only been, a little while before this, on the order of, 1.5 centuries or so, when you had the slave revolts, the mid-2nd century BC, I think it was. I'm not remembering exactly offhand, so I could be mistaken. Correct me if I'm wrong in the comments. But I think in the 2nd century BC was when you had the slave revolts led by Spartacus. I'm Spartacus. No, I'm Spartacus. No, I'm Spartacus. Yeah, that guy from the movie, although, ancient reality, a little bit different. That didn't happen. But slave revolts happened, and Rome just crucified everybody. That's kind of what they did. And there were still some more slave rebellions that happened up through the mid-1st century BC, like 50s and 60s BC, around that time. Again, I'm going dates off memory, so it could be a little bit off. And they were really, really sensitive about the slave issue. And if anybody had called for the freedom of slaves, Rome would have just crucified him immediately. Paul would have gotten away with being beheaded because he was a Roman citizen, but he'd have been killed. And anybody who listened to him or followed him or was connected with him, they would have been killed. So the likelihood that, a wandering preacher in this brand new religion could have ended slavery, there's no way. I don't think even Caesar could have probably ended slavery. If Caesar, any one of the Caesars had called for the freeing of slaves, it probably would have just been murdered by people who had a lot of slaves and rich and powerful. They'd have just killed them. There's no way. So Paul did not have the ability to actually, change the law. So he had to find some way of changing things without changing the law. So first thing you understand that's going on here, there's 3 big categories of things that Paul is doing. One, he's interacting with Aristotle and the centuries-old discussion on how a household should be organized. Number 2, he's trying to fly under the radar of Rome and not get himself and all of his followers killed. And number 3, he's trying to actually deal with the situation in Colossae, which is, sort of why he's writing this letter. So there's 3 major situations that Paul is interacting with all at the same time. And you have to understand and I think appreciate what he's trying to do when you come to these verses, because he's navigating an extremely complex situation. So with that in mind, let's take a look at what he actually says in the letter. And there's a lot of stuff here. I'm just going to point out a couple of points to sort of give you an idea of where he's going and what he's doing with this. The first thing is that in each of these three pairs, three reciprocal pairs, you have, the husband, wife, father, children, master, slave. One point of departure from that he takes relative to Aristotle is that he actually addresses the lesser or the subordinate or the less powerful party in each of those pairs. Aristotle just addressed, say, the husband in the husband-wife. He said, husbands, make your wives submit. That's how it would have read. In Paul, he said, wives, submit to your husbands, and, husbands, love your wives. So the first thing that happened is Paul actually addresses the lesser or the less powerful party in each of the three pairs because he's treating them as a responsible agent. In the ancient world, wives would not have been treated as responsible agents. They didn't get to make their own decisions. They didn't get to choose how they should or should not act. That was determined for them. They had no choice. Paul said, no, you do have a choice. You're a responsible agent capable of making your own decisions and determining your own actions. So, determine your own actions. And he explained the way that he thinks that they should go, but he treated them as responsible agents. And we'll get to the way that he thinks they should go in just a minute. So, number one, he treats the less powerful parties as responsible agents, which was unheard of in the ancient world. Number two, he balances the call for the less powerful party to be subordinate with a command to the more powerful party. Husbands, love your wives. Now remember, we talked about love, or agape, in the last video quite a lot. And the idea behind love is it's not an emotion feeling. It's not like why husbands have rainbow and unicorn thought towards your wife, like have, warm fuzzies towards them. That's not it. It's husbands act selflessly on your wife's behalf. Another thing that was just not done in the ancient world. That's not how husbands and wives interacted. But he's telling them, okay, your wives are going to submit to you, follow you, they're going to let you lead them. You act selflessly on their behalf. Treat them as you would want to be treated. Again, not something that's going on, very commonly in the ancient world. Looking at the master-slave relationship, slaves are supposed to do their best work for their master, which was, slaves don't do that. Why in the world would you try your best for somebody who owns you? Like, I wouldn't. But he says that this is what you should do. And there's reasons for that. Again, we're going to get to that in just a minute. On what he tells the masters, though, is like, look, you're supposed to treat them fairly. And remember, you have a master in heaven too. So he's like, yeah, don't think you're all high and mighty because you have the power here too. You serve someone. You were someone else's slave. And God is going to treat you as you treated those who are under you. There's a parable in the Gospels about that. And so he's really knocking the masters down a bit and reminding them, look, everybody serves somebody. Just because you have somebody serving you, it's not going to be like this forever. And you need to remember that. I want to make one more interesting note on slavery before we move on to the next thing that we're going to talk about. And that's who the letter was carried by. And now, if you look at the end of the letter, at the end of, in chapter 4, when he gets to all the, the parts that we tend to skip because they're just boring, Paul gives shout outs to various people. The letter is carried by Onesimus. Now, if you've read Philemon, the one chapter letter in the New Testament, at the end of Paul's writings, Philemon had a slave named Onesimus. Onesimus ran away and stole some stuff from Philemon. And basically what happened is he made his way to Paul, ended up converting, and then what happened now is Paul is sending him back to the same place that he came from. So here's this runaway slave who converted to Christianity, and Paul is getting him to carry this letter back to the Colossians. The thing is, in the ancient world, a letter carrier was not a mere postman. Like, he wasn't just carrying the letter because somebody had to carry it. It's like, no, the person who carried the letter was an actual like emissary. It was a sent person of importance from Paul, because no doubt, like, the people who got this letter are going to have some questions. We have questions on Paul, like, Paul, what do you really mean by this? Well, the person who was carrying the letter would answer those questions. That was their job, because the letter carrier would have spoken to, Paul, and Paul had explained all those things to him, so that when the people who got the letter had questions, then the letter carrier would explain it to them and say, this is what you're supposed to do. So here these people are in Colossae, many of them slave owners, who are being instructed by a former slave, someone they probably knew, at least some of them probably knew him, and they're having to listen to him and take orders from him. What a strange situation. So that kind of shows you what Paul thinks about slavery, like, in real life. He's not able to change the situation, but like, he doesn't care about your earthly status, because to him, like, if you read the rest of his writings, it's about your status before God that matters, not your earthly status. And he proves that by sending Onesimus with the letter back to the Colossians and saying, you tell them what I mean, and they're going to have to listen to you because you were my chosen emissary, my chosen person to send this letter. So there's that. I just wanted to explain that because I think that helps you get a little bit better idea of what Paul really thinks about slavery, even though he's trying to, navigate this complex social situation with Rome and everything. So what's going on? What is he hoping for them to accomplish? Well, if you remember last week, what I was talking about was that this section of the letter, this household code is what it's called, is basically a case study on how to work out all the stuff he's been talking about in chapter 3, about how to live right and do the right things and not do the wrong things and live with a heavenly focus and try to, be the image of Christ and represent Christ and do what he would do here on earth. Paul takes a very, very difficult situation that makes no sense. It's probably very painful to a lot of people, and then they can't get out of, and says, okay, here's how you live in a non-ideal situation. And this basically gives us insight into how Paul thinks people should interact with the world, because he's like, okay, you're living for this world above, you're trying to live after this heavenly pattern of life, and you're trying to make a difference in the world. How do you do that? Well, there's a few options. If you live in and among everybody else and live just like them, you're not going to make any difference because you're just like them. So that's not going to work. If you live in a perfect society, but you live apart from everybody else, you're not going to make any difference. You're going to be like the Essenes. And if you just asked, who are the Essenes? I've just made my point. In the first century, there was also before and after, but not as much after. But in the first century, there were several main groups of people. You had like of Jewish, religious orders. Like you have the Pharisees. We know who the Pharisees are. With the Sadducees, maybe not as many people know who they are, but they're like the religious leaders who are connected with the temple. You have some the Pharisees are more like the common preachers that would have more identified with the people. The Sadducees were a little more highbrow, more dissociated from the people, had a little more power. You have the Herodians, people who were more connected with the political side of things and trying to, work with the Gentile governments that nobody liked to try to get stuff done. You had the Sicarii, who were more like the revolutionaries, and Sicarii came from the name for the blade that they carried, and that kind of tells you all you need to know. And there were several groups, and there were also the Essenes, who were these people who went out in the middle of the desert and tried to live life perfectly clean, perfectly pure, perfectly, holy, and do everything right. And these were the people who lived at Qumran, were one of the sect of the Essenes, which is where we get the Dead Sea Scrolls from. But most people don't even know who they are. And the reason for that is because they made little difference to the people around them, because they went off and lived separately and they did their own thing and they didn't interact with the culture around them. So not quite as important. And basically what we're being told to do is don't be like that. Fine, you do everything all right, great, that's good for you, but what difference are you making in the world around you? So you don't want to live in and among everybody else and be just like them because you're not going to make any difference. You don't want to live apart from everybody else and be perfect because then you're not making any difference. So the only way to make a difference really is to be in and among everybody else, but be different at the same time. And the way you do that is to live and work and operate and move and have your life in the world's broken systems while living and being different. And that's a really hard thing to do. And that's what this household code really gets at, is how do you live in a bad situation, but be better? So what he was telling people to do is to live above what is required for you. Do something different. If a wife voluntarily submitted to or followed her husband when she didn't want to, everybody's going to be like, why in the world is she doing that? That makes no sense. If a slave really did their best to do what was right, to not what was right, to do their best at their work, and I mean, that was extremely that just didn't happen. Everybody would be like, what in the world is going on with that guy? Like, why is he doing that? And that's really the question that Paul wants people to ask. Why are those people living that way? They don't have to. That's not normal. There's no earthly reason why they would do that. And that's the question he wants people to ask. Yes, there is no earthly reason why they would do this, but there is a heavenly reason. Now, ultimately, a lot of the things that Paul was doing in this letter did lead to a lot of the social change that we wanted to see. Slavery, for example. Paul had no ability to change the law. We've talked about that. He just couldn't. But there's two sides to the slavery problem. We in the United States, we made slavery legal a long time ago, and yet we're still dealing with the discrimination problems. That hasn't gone away, and that's a really difficult problem to solve because it gets at the heart issue, which you can't really legislate. Now, both sides are important, both the legal side and the heart side. Both are necessary to change if you want to have true equality. But since Paul couldn't do the one, the legal side, what he did actually did affect the other quite a lot. If he could get rid of the discrimination between, in this case, it was less of a racial issue, it was more of a class issue. If he could get rid of the discrimination, that would make it a whole lot easier in the long run for when law could eventually be changed. There's less of a foundation, less of a bad foundation for people to be basing slavery on. So if you can get rid of the discrimination, it makes it harder for bad laws to stay in effect. Also, it helps people in the short term because even though they're still in a bad situation, it's not as bad if people are treating them better than they have to. So he was doing what he could, and same thing with wives and husbands as well. He was doing what he could to make the immediate situation better. It was not everything that we would have wished for, but it was what he could do. He was making the situation better. But at the same time, he was trying to get people to focus on the things above and to live for something more than just how pleasant or unpleasant your life is right now, which is admittedly hard to not focus on. But that's what he was talking about in verses 1-4 of chapter 3 of the letter, that which we talked about, that heavenly focus versus the earthly focus. You were to live for a purpose and not just live to make your daily life a little bit better. You take care of the things in your daily life that are necessary to make living for the world above possible. Ultimately, you're trying to fix the brokenness in the world around you, which includes yourself, and to make the world around you a little bit more beautiful, which includes yourself. That is the primary purpose of Christians, and that's what Paul is trying to tell them how to do. You're in a bad situation. Here's how to fulfill your heavenly task in a situation you can't control. And understanding how that worked in the ancient world, I think, can give us a lot of help with the direction for how we work on situations like that today. How do we work? How do we live for something better and to make a positive long-term difference in the world around us when we can't change the immediate circumstances we're in? It's a really hard problem to solve, but that's why I think this passage is really, really helpful, because Paul actually answers that question head on. And most of us miss that because we're so focused on the things that are super objectionable to us, and they really are. I'm not trying to downgrade that or belittle it. They are. But when you understand that he's interacting with Aristotle's thoughts, he's trying to fly under the radar of Rome and deal with the situation at Colossae all at the same time, then maybe you won't read it at quite such a surface level, and you'll understand the real point that he's trying to get at, which is learning how to live for something greater and more long-term than your immediate situation. And how do you live for something more when you're in a bad situation that you can't change? And that's what this section of the letter is really about.